When Jake opened the door, he never expected to face the smug grin of the man who'd been sleeping with his wife. "She's mine now," the intruder sneered, threatening to ruin Jake's life with lawsuits and lies. But what he didn't know was that Jake wasn't about to collapse. He was about to unleash a perfectly legal storm that would leave them both gasping for air. Jake Miller had always believed that when a marriage ended, it usually slipped away quietly. Cold dinners, missed calls, polite distance growing over time. He never imagined it would end with a man he barely knew standing on his porch at 9 o'clock at night, smirking like he'd just won a bet. The doorbell rang once. Jake set down his coffee, feeling something tighten in his chest. He wasn't surprised to see Brandon Cole when he opened the door. He'd already suspected Emily was seeing someone, but he hadn't expected the man to show up at his house uninvited. Brandon didn't bother with introductions or apologies. He leaned one hand on the doorframe, his posture casual but his eyes full of contempt. "Evening," Brandon said, his voice low and steady. "Thought it was time we had a chat." Jake didn't reply. He stepped aside just enough to keep the door from closing on his own hand, but not enough to invite Brandon in. Brandon tilted his head, clearly amused by Jake's silence. "I'm sure you know who I am by now. Emily and I, well, it's not a secret anymore. She's been staying with me when you're out of town. She told me you'd probably take this badly." Jake felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. "You came here to gloat?" Jake asked. "No," Brandon said, though his grin gave him away. "I came here to help you accept reality. She's mine now. You need to stop calling her. Stop texting. Stop pretending this marriage isn't over." Jake could almost hear his heart pounding, but his voice stayed even. "And you thought the best way to tell me was to show up here unannounced?" Brandon's smile faded a little. "If you don't back off, I'll bury you. I have enough money to drag you through court for years. Restraining orders, defamation claims, whatever it takes. You'll be too broke to keep your business running, let alone fight for her." There it was, the threat he must have rehearsed 100 times. Jake had always heard men like Brandon didn't care who they destroyed, as long as they got what they wanted. Seeing it in person was something else. "I'm not interested in fighting over someone who wants to leave," Jake said quietly. "That's good," Brandon said, stepping forward like he owned the threshold. "Because while you're drowning in court dates and debt, I'll still be with her. And when I'm tired of her, you can have her back. Used up, broken, yours again." For a moment, Jake's vision narrowed. It wasn't the words so much as the casual way Brandon said them, like he'd already decided Jake was too weak to respond. Jake didn't plan what happened next. He simply stepped forward and drove his fist into Brandon's face. The impact was immediate, hard, final. Brandon staggered back, clutching his nose. A bright spray of blood splattered across the porch. He tried to curse, but Jake was already moving. His boot came up fast, catching Brandon square in the groin. The man folded with a guttural wheeze, collapsing onto the concrete. Brandon rolled onto his side, coughing and spitting blood. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled too badly to hold his weight. Jake looked down at him, feeling strangely calm. He had never hit another person like that. But standing over Brandon now, he didn't feel guilt. Only a certainty that he wouldn't let this man decide the terms of anything. "You're going to get up," Jake said evenly. "And you're going to leave. If you ever set foot here again, it won't just be your teeth you lose." Brandon didn't argue. He pressed a shaking hand to his ruined nose and nodded once, eyes watering. Jake turned and stepped inside, shutting the door with deliberate finality. He flipped the deadbolt and stood still, listening for the sound of Brandon dragging himself back to his car. When it was quiet again, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart still hammered, but he knew this wasn't over. Men like Brandon didn't stop when they were humiliated, they came back smarter and meaner. Jake went to the hallway closet and pulled out the small black box he kept for emergencies. Inside was a spare phone, a portable hard drive, and a folder of legal contacts he'd never thought he'd need. He set the phone on the table and scrolled to the number from Mark Henderson, the attorney who'd helped him incorporate his business years ago. Jake had no intention of fighting over Emily herself. If she wanted to be with a man like Brandon, that was her choice. But he would not let them ruin what he'd built out of spite. He pressed the call button, and when Mark picked up, Jake didn't bother with small talk. "I'm going to need your help," he said. "Tonight." There was a pause. What happened? Jake looked around the house he'd once shared with Emily. Every room now a memory he could no longer trust. "Someone tried to threaten me into walking away," he said. "I'm not going to do that. I'm going to end this the right way." He hung up before Mark could reply. Outside, Brandon's car engine turned over, then faded into the distance. Jake sat down, steadying his breathing. If Brandon thought intimidation would make him surrender, he was about to learn that a man who's already lost everything has nothing left to fear, and nothing left to lose. Jake didn't bother to sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the glow of the screen the only light he needed. Every hour that passed without a call from Emily felt like proof that Brandon had been telling the truth. She was gone in every way that mattered. But her absence wasn't what kept Jake awake. What drove him was the certainty that Brandon would keep coming. The threats of lawsuits weren't idle. A man that smug had money and connections, and if Jake didn't act first, he would be the one cornered. By the time dawn came, Jake had reviewed every document he might need. Marriage certificates, business licenses, property deeds. He pulled the footage from his front door camera, copied it onto 3 different drives, and saved it in cloud storage. He wasn't just going to defend himself, he was going to make sure Brandon had no room to twist the story. When Mark Henderson called back at 7 a.m., Jake answered on the first ring. "Tell me everything," Mark said without preamble. Jake described the confrontation, word for word, starting with Brandon's threats and ending with the moment he watched him limp back to his car. Mark listened without interruption. When Jake finished, there was a long pause. "First things first," Mark said. "He trespassed. He threatened you with baseless litigation and tried to intimidate you into surrendering marital assets. That's extortion, plain and simple. And you have the recording?" "Crystal clear," Jake said. "Good. I'm filing for a restraining order this morning. Once that's in place, he'll be breaking the law if he shows up again." Jake nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. "What about Emily? We'll need to file for divorce before he has time to pressure her into making claims against you. You've got evidence of her adultery?" "I have her texts, credit card statements, and video footage of him entering the house while I was out of town." "That's more than enough. I'll prepare the paperwork." After the call, Jake made another list. People he trusted, people who needed to know what was happening. He wasn't going to let rumors spread without facts. So he called his business partner first, explaining that there might be noise in the coming weeks. He kept the explanation simple. His marriage had ended, and someone involved might try to stir up trouble. When that was done, he turned his attention back to Brandon. For a man who liked to brag about his money, Brandon had left a long trail online. Jake found his LinkedIn profile, his consulting website, and the names of several companies he worked with. By mid-morning, Mark emailed him a draft restraining order. Jake read it twice before replying with his approval. It didn't just cite the threats. Mark included Brandon's statements about destroying Jake's reputation and forcing him into debt. The wording was precise and unemotional, and it left no room for doubt that Brandon had crossed the line. Within hours, a process server delivered the papers to Brandon's office. Jake could picture it easily. Brandon sitting behind a glass desk, probably surrounded by people he was trying to impress. The moment he unfolded the paperwork and realized he was being held accountable, the arrogance would drain right out of him. That was step 1. Step 2 was making sure Brandon's professional life felt the impact. Jake knew his actions weren't about petty revenge. They were about establishing boundaries, showing that he wouldn't be bullied into submission. So he prepared a set of emails. No threats, no emotional outbursts, just clear statements of fact. He attached copies of the restraining order, along with excerpts from Brandon's recorded threats, and sent them to the boards of directors at 3 of Brandon's largest clients. The subject line was simple: professional conduct concerns. He didn't sign his name. The evidence spoke for itself. By noon, Jake received the first notification that the emails had been opened. While he waited for fallout, he turned to the divorce filings. Mark sent over the petition, citing adultery and requesting a full accounting of marital assets. Jake signed it without hesitation. Emily had made her choice the moment she walked out the door without explanation. Late that afternoon, Mark called again. "I spoke with a contact at Brandon's firm," Mark said. "They're taking the restraining order seriously. You may want to prepare for some form of retaliation." "I'm already prepared," Jake said. "Good. Because I'm also filing for a civil suit for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We have all the documentation we need." Jake thanked him and ended the call. He felt no satisfaction, only a clear, steady focus. Brandon had wanted a war. Jake was willing to give it to him, but on his own terms. That evening, Jake drove to a storage unit he'd rented a year ago when he needed extra space for his business inventory. He began moving out the few personal items he didn't want to risk leaving in the house. Important records, irreplaceable keepsakes. Not because he was afraid Brandon would show up again, because he refused to let the man damage anything else he valued. When he got back, he checked his email again. One message stood out. It was from Brandon's company HR department, confirming they had received the evidence and were reviewing Brandon's conduct in light of their ethical guidelines. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling a weight shift. This wasn't the end, but it was the first time since the confrontation that he felt like he had a measure of control. Just after midnight, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Emily. "We need to talk." He didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he opened the file where he was keeping every document, recording, and email related to Brandon and Emily. He labeled it simply, "Evidence." Then he powered off his phone and went to bed. For the first time in weeks, he slept without waking up every hour. He knew the fight wasn't over. But Brandon had underestimated something important. When a man stops caring about appearances, he becomes much harder to intimidate. And Jake had stopped caring the moment Emily walked away. Jake woke early the next morning to find the first cracks spreading through Brandon's carefully polished life. His inbox was flooded with notifications. Read receipts from the emails he had sent to Brandon's clients, confirmations from court filings, and a new message from Mark. Brandon's legal team reached out. They're trying to negotiate a cease and desist in exchange for dropping their threats of litigation. "Do not respond directly. We'll handle everything." Jake didn't reply to Brandon's lawyers. He knew that was exactly what they wanted, to pull him into a negotiation he didn't need. Instead, he forwarded everything to Mark and continued with his plans. He began the next phase by compiling all the evidence against Emily. It wasn't an emotional act. It was a necessary step to protect himself. He made sure every piece of proof was backed up twice. The text messages showed affection and coordination between her and Brandon, including discussions about moving in together and mocking Jake behind his back. The credit card statements left no doubt where they'd been and how much they'd spent. When he had everything organized, he sent copies to Mark so the divorce filing could proceed without delay. He also prepared a second anonymous package. This one addressed to Emily's HR department at the marketing firm where she'd worked for nearly a decade. He included only verified records, hotel bills, transaction dates, and excerpts of conversations. No commentary, no exaggeration. The facts were damning enough without any flourish. Before he sealed the envelope, he paused for a moment. He tried to feel something. Pity, regret, nostalgia. But the ache had been replaced by clarity. Emily had chosen her path. He was simply refusing to let her rewrite the story to make him the villain. By mid-morning, Jake drove to the nearest courier service and paid for next-day delivery. When he handed over the package, he felt no second thoughts. He would not protect the people who had tried to break him. Back home, he checked his security cameras. Brandon's car hadn't appeared again. Maybe the restraining order was finally doing its job. Or maybe Brandon was too busy trying to salvage his career to show up in person. Jake logged onto LinkedIn and searched Brandon's name again. He wasn't surprised to find that Brandon had removed his profile photo and set his account to private. More telling were the public updates from two of Brandon's former clients. Both companies had quietly announced they were ending their contracts with his consulting firm. He didn't take pleasure in Brandon's downfall, but he felt relief knowing that a man who had threatened to ruin him was now watching his own reputation collapse. Later that afternoon, Mark called with an update. Emily was served the divorce petition, Mark said. She hasn't responded yet. That's normal. Her lawyer will reach out soon. What about Brandon's side? Jake asked. His team is trying to claim you attacked him unprovoked. We've already submitted the video footage showing him threatening you. I'm not concerned. Neither should you be. Understood. Mark paused before continuing. Jake, you're handling this better than most people would. If you need to talk, I'm fine, Jake said, cutting him off gently. I appreciate everything you're doing. Just keep me posted. After the call ended, Jake sat alone for a moment. The house was too quiet, but he refused to fill the silence with distractions. He needed to stay focused. By the end of the week, Brandon's situation had worsened. Another client severed ties, citing unprofessional conduct. Jake suspected that more would follow once word spread. Brandon's arrogance had left a long trail of burned bridges. On Friday evening, Jake's phone buzzed with a call from a blocked number. He let it go to voicemail. When he played the message, he heard Brandon's voice. Jake, listen, this is out of hand. Let's be reasonable. I don't want this to get uglier. Call me back. Jake deleted the message without saving it. The next day, Emily finally responded to the divorce filing. Through her attorney, she tried to claim Jake had been emotionally distant and controlling, that the affair was a symptom of a failing marriage. But Mark had already anticipated this strategy. He submitted the financial records and video evidence showing Emily's deliberate deception, and he included a timeline proving that her relationship with Brandon began months before she even discussed separation. The more they tried to twist the narrative, the more the truth emerged. That weekend, Jake's business partner, Dan, invited him to lunch. Over coffee, Dan asked carefully, "You sure you're okay?" "I'm better than I've been in a long time," Jake said truthfully. Dan nodded. "If you need anything, just ask." "I know. Thanks." Jake left the cafe feeling lighter. It struck him that Brandon and Emily had tried so hard to humiliate him, but all they'd really done was show him who he could trust. On Monday morning, Jake received a short email from Emily's employer. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We take these matters seriously and will review the information thoroughly." He closed the message and sat back. He knew what came next. Emily would be called into meetings she couldn't talk her way out of. Her spotless record would fracture, just like Brandon's. Later that evening, Jake received another text from Emily. "Please, we can work this out." He didn't reply. He knew any response would be twisted into leverage. Silence was the only answer left. As the days passed, he kept to his routine. He worked, exercised, ate dinner alone without feeling bitter. The emptiness was better than the constant uncertainty. A week later, Mark called with the latest update. "Emily's team is asking for mediation," he said. "They know the evidence is overwhelming. If you agree, we can negotiate the terms of the settlement quickly." "No mediation," Jake said. "She made her choice. I'm not compromising." "Understood." Jake ended the call and went for a walk through the neighborhood. The evening air was cool and still. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just reacting anymore. He was moving forward on his own terms. Brandon and Emily had believed they could shame him into submission, that he'd be too afraid to fight back. But they'd miscalculated. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure that the people who tried to tear down his life would have to face the consequences, fully and publicly. And he wasn't finished yet. It didn't take long for the consequences to find them. By the second week after the divorce papers were served, Jake began receiving updates from Mark almost daily. Emily's employer had concluded their internal review. They didn't fire her outright, but she was suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. For someone whose job relied on maintaining a spotless reputation, that was as good as an ending. Mark's voice over the phone was steady as he laid out the facts. "She'll likely resign before they complete the process. Even if she doesn't, she'll never hold the same position again." Jake felt no satisfaction in hearing it. He hadn't set out to ruin her career. He'd only sent the evidence so she couldn't pretend she was the victim. The damage had been done by her own choices. Meanwhile, Brandon's situation grew worse by the day. Another of his biggest clients, a regional tech company, publicly terminated their contract with his consultancy. They cited breach of ethics in their brief statement. Word spread quickly in those circles, and before the week was out, at least 3 more clients had cut ties. Jake watched it all unfold from a distance. He knew Brandon was probably scrambling to save face. But no statement or denial could erase the restraining order or the evidence of his threats. By the end of the month, Brandon's company was essentially a shell. His website was offline, and his business line went straight to voicemail. Rumors circulated online that he was trying to rebrand under a different name, but the damage followed him wherever he went. One afternoon, Mark called with an update. Brandon's attorneys reached out again. They're offering to drop all remaining claims if you'll agree not to pursue further action. He's desperate to stop the bleeding. Jake didn't hesitate. Decline. You're sure? I'm sure. I won't be intimidated, and I won't pretend none of this happened. Understood, Mark said. I'll relay your decision. Later that evening, Jake checked his email and found yet another message from Brandon. Jake, this has gone too far. You've made your point. Let's end this before we all lose everything. He didn't reply. The next day, a letter arrived at Jake's office. This time from Emily herself. It wasn't official correspondence. Just a handwritten note on plain stationery. Jake, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I made choices I can't undo. But I want you to know I never planned for any of this to happen. Brandon promised me everything. He said you'd end up broken and that we'd be free. I believed him. Now I see what he really is. I'm sorry. He read it once, folded it neatly, and set it aside. He didn't need an apology to move on. The following week, Mark confirmed the divorce had been finalized. Emily received no spousal support. She retained only the personal property she'd brought into the marriage. No house, no shared savings, nothing she hadn't earned herself. That same day, Jake received an alert from a professional networking site. Brandon had deleted his profile completely. It was the final sign that Brandon's career was beyond repair. One evening, Jake was working late when his security camera app pinged. He opened the feed to see Emily standing on the porch, her shoulders slumped, one hand pressed to the door as if she could will it to open. She knocked once, then again. After a minute, she sank down onto the top step. He watched her sit there in the dark, her head in her hands. He didn't get up. He didn't unlock the door. After nearly 10 minutes, she wiped her eyes and stood. She looked up at the camera, maybe wondering if he was watching, and then she turned and walked back down the driveway to the waiting car. He didn't feel triumph as she left, just a clean, certain distance. The next morning, he called Dan, his business partner, and asked him to meet for breakfast. They sat together over eggs and coffee, and Jake explained that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations for a while. I need some time to figure out what comes next, he said simply. Dan nodded. Take all the time you need. You've earned it. When he hung up, Jake realized how different this ending felt compared to the night Brandon had shown up. Back then, everything had felt chaotic and out of control. Now, for the first time, there was nothing left for Brandon or Emily to take. His business was stable. His finances were secure. He'd already started the process of selling the house. There were too many memories in those walls, and none of them were worth preserving. As the days turned into weeks, he began to rebuild the parts of his life they hadn't been able to touch. He spent time with friends he'd neglected, went on long drives without checking his phone, and let the silence feel like peace instead of punishment. One afternoon, Mark called with a final update. Brandon has officially dropped all pending claims, Mark said. He's also signed an agreement not to contact you again. If he does, it will violate the restraining order and open him to criminal charges. Thank you, Jake said. There's one last thing. Emily's attorney requested a meeting, but you're under no obligation to attend. Let them know I'm not interested. Consider it done. After he hung up, Jake went out to the porch where Emily had stood weeks earlier. He looked at the spot where she'd cried, searching for a reaction in himself. Nothing came. It wasn't relief or satisfaction. It was simply the absence of anything. The end. He went back inside, locked the door, and turned out the light. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew he wouldn't carry the weight of their choices anymore. The people who had tried to break him were busy fighting for scraps of their own lives, and he was free to decide what to do with his own. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Jake packed the last box from the house he'd once shared with Emily. He'd hired movers to handle the big pieces, but the smaller things, old photographs, papers, a few keepsakes, he wanted to sort himself. He didn't feel anger as he worked, just a calm certainty that this place no longer had any claim over him. Every room had been the backdrop to something he'd outgrown. When the final box was loaded, Jake walked through the house one last time to be sure he hadn't left anything behind. He stopped in the entryway where Brandon had once stood, full of threats and smug certainty. Felt like a lifetime ago. He locked the door and handed the keys to his realtor without a second thought. Jake moved into a new place across town. A smaller house he'd bought outright, no memories attached. It wasn't an escape. It was a fresh start. In the weeks that followed, he focused on expanding his business. Freed from the constant stress and uncertainty, he poured his energy into projects he'd put off for years. New partnerships, new markets, and a team that respected him not just as a boss but as a person. His success was no accident. It was the result of months of work, discipline, and a refusal to let the betrayal define him. Occasionally, people tried to bring up what had happened. Friends who had watched it unfold with concern would ask carefully, "How are you really doing?" Jake's answer never changed. "Better than I ever thought I would be." When he wasn't working, he traveled. Short trips to places he'd always meant to visit but never had the time. He hiked trails in Colorado, spent a week on the Oregon coast, and drove through quiet stretches of Texas with no schedule. He learned to enjoy being alone, not because he was hiding, but because he finally understood that solitude wasn't something to fear. One afternoon, while he was checking his business email, he noticed a message had slipped through his spam filter. The sender was Brandon. Jake opened it without hesitation. "Jake, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need you to understand something. I've lost everything, my clients, my reputation, my income. Emily and I haven't spoken in weeks. None of this was supposed to happen. I thought I was in control. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll believe that I regret it." He read the message twice, then archived it without replying. Brandon's regret didn't matter. Nothing he could say would change what he'd done. Emily, for her part, never tried to contact Jake again. Word eventually reached him through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another city and was working a lower-level marketing job. Her life had become smaller, not because Jake had forced it, but because she'd gambled everything on a man who turned out to be as selfish as she was. He didn't hate her. He simply no longer thought about her at all. That was the real freedom, when her name stopped stirring any feeling, good or bad. In time, Jake's business grew beyond what he'd imagined. With every contract he signed and every new client he secured, he proved to himself that he was capable of thriving on his own merits. The success wasn't about proving anything to Brandon or Emily anymore. It was about building a life that reflected who he was, not who they'd tried to convince him he should be. One evening, he hosted a dinner for his team to celebrate a major contract. As the meal wound down, Dan pulled him aside. "You know," Dan said, "I remember when this all started. You looked like you were carrying the weight of the world. And now, you look free." Jake thought about that for a moment. "I am," he said simply. As he drove home that night, Jake reflected on everything he'd survived. He remembered the threats, the humiliation, the nights he'd wondered if he'd ever feel normal again. And he realized those experiences had shaped him, but they didn't own him. He was no longer the man who had opened his front door to find Brandon gloating on his porch. That version of himself was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more resolute. His story wasn't one of revenge, despite how it looked from the outside. It was a story of refusing to accept defeat when others tried to decide who he was allowed to be. Jake knew there were people who would say he'd gone too far, sending evidence to employers, refusing to compromise. But he didn't see it that way. He'd never lied. He'd never made threats he didn't intend to keep. He'd only held up a mirror so that Brandon and Emily could see what they'd done. In the end, their downfall wasn't something he'd orchestrated alone. It was the predictable result of their choices. He drove the last few miles in silence, the road unfolding ahead in the dark. When he pulled into his driveway, he turned off the engine and sat for a moment, appreciating the simple fact that no one was waiting to ambush him, accuse him, or demand anything. His life was quiet, honest, his own, and every day he moved forward was another day that proved they hadn't won. Jake stepped out of the car and walked to his front door without hesitation. This was the ending they had never expected. He wasn't destroyed. He was free.